It's working. It's working. Crazy. Yeah. Thank you so much. Crazy time. I love it. I love it. Okay, good morning to everybody. Want to thank again Professor Mermelstein for joining us the last Jewish history module of the year. So I know that many were here, but some were not. And so I just wanted to reiterate, we look forward to seeing everybody at 7 o'clock tonight. Our every thought is with Am Yisrael and Eretz Yisrael. Obviously, that goes without saying, but we're going to say it. Tonight we're going to kind of refashion the program. In light of that, we're going to celebrate our year of learning. Thank you to everybody who's coming in person. Thank you to everybody who's contributing. It really makes it possible. And at the same time, of course, the only appropriate way to celebrate is by integrating all of our tefillos for Eretz Yisrael. We'll begin at 7 o'clock right here with Mincha. Then we'll move into the auditorium right here for the dinner. We'll have an opportunity to say Tehillim, to say the Mishaberach for the Chayalim and for the many, many hundreds who have been wounded, and continue to daven for the success of this vital operation and for a much, much better future, being rid of the Iranian nuclear program and the missile program. So we're going to try our best to really, capture that sense tonight. Starting at 7 o'clock, we'll finish with Mariv at just about 8:30. Again, I want to thank Rebbe Tzanlaya for her incredible efforts to bring everything together. And of course, Esti, who's off in Israel. And it's a good thing that we're not meeting next week, because I don't think we'd be able to have her back with us next week. Everybody should have Besoros Tovos, and everybody's family, of course, should be well. I look around the room and I see so many people with children, with grandchildren in Israel. So we're thinking of everybody at this time. Professor Mermelstein.
Okay, so this is the second part in the two-part series that we started a couple of weeks ago. So it's been a few weeks, so let me just refresh everybody's memories. Was there anybody who wasn't here 2 weeks ago? Totally fine, absolutely fine. So it just means I'm going to do just a little bit more reiteration. Absolutely fine. Okay, so what we began looking at a couple of weeks ago was the way in which Philo of Alexandria, this character that we introduced from the 1st century CE, can be thought of as sort of a proto-modern Orthodox Jew. So let me just, again, even for everybody who was here, just some of the chronology and some of the personalities that we talked about might just be worth reviewing. So we said that Alexander the Great overruns the ancient Near East in the year 332. That basically initiates the period of the Hellenistic era. So that is the influence of Greek into Israel and the wider Near East. Alexandria becomes basically the primary hub in the eastern portion of sort of what will become the Greco-Roman Empire, becomes the important hub of Alexander's emerging empire. Alexandria becomes not only an important capital within the Greek world, it also becomes the center of intellectual discourse within that Greek world. The world-famous Alexandrian Library, which is where you have a collection of scholars who are assiduously studying Homeric literature. That's where they're gathered. And it also becomes the most important diaspora community, basically to the west of Bavel, throughout this period. And Bavel is not yet an emerging force. And so Alexandria really is the most important diaspora community at this time. It's a community that has a massive Jewish community, again, going back pretty much as far as Alexander's conquest. So we're talking about really the 3rd century BCE. We already have a massive Jewish presence in this city. We're going to see later today that there were already very important writers in Alexandria several centuries before Philo of Alexandria. So even though we're focusing our attention on things from the 1st century CE, so it's like 400 years after Alexander's conquest, we already see important forebears to Philo several centuries earlier. Okay, that was kind of what we saw last time in terms of some of the historical background. One other thing that we said of importance for understanding this community is that it's a community that, while immensely steeped in, at least in learning. For some, Philo being an outstanding example, which is not to say that there was widespread literacy, but apparently there was a critical mass of people who studied Torah, who understood Torah, who were engaged with their Judaism. It's also a community that is functionally illiterate, namely that doesn't speak any Hebrew, that doesn't read Hebrew, that even while we said that Philo is probably the most prolific single interpreter of Chumash in Jewish history, single interpreter, he writes completely in Greek, and as far as we can tell, is completely reliant on the Greek translation of the Torah for doing so. And so we have this interesting mix of somebody who is at the same time deeply learned, at the same time very prolific, but is also really not conversant with the Hebrew original. We don't really have a parallel for it. We think about kind of the contemporary landscape. It would be the equivalent of somebody who is remarkably learned in sort of the Orthodox tradition of interpretation, but at the same time can't read any of the Hebrew, is completely reliant on the Art Scroll translation. We don't have that kind of model when we think about, when I talk about him as sort of proto-modern Orthodox, we don't have a parallel model for a modern Orthodox biblical interpreter like that of Philo. Yeah, Joseph.
Any reason why he didn't learn Hebrew? I assume there would have been a way for him to learn Hebrew. I assume it was such in the Alexandria library, must have been a Hebrew something.
Okay, so we'll come to the Alexandrian library and what it may have had from, from collection of Jewish books a little bit later. It's hard to, we don't know enough about, as much as we know about the Alexandrian community, we don't know enough to say that there were definitely people there who spoke Hebrew, for example. Philo was certainly one of the outstanding members of that community. What I said last time also is that Philo is not only deeply learned, but Philo is importantly politically involved. And so there was an occasion I talked about last time where conflict broke out between the Jews and the Alexandrian Greeks. Both sides of this conflict went on a sort of a diplomatic mission to Rome, to the Roman emperor, and Philo was at the head of that embassy, which means that Philo is not only somebody who is an important thinker, but he's also an important political leader. So if Philo, this important thinker and important political leader, didn't know Hebrew, were there those in the community who did know Hebrew? So I think just what you're struggling with is we don't have a model like that. And I think that's an important point. Philo is, and so therefore what we're really doing is we're doing two things. What we're doing is introducing some important personalities and a very important community that probably largely goes overlooked when we think about sort of the course of Jewish history, to the extent that our understanding of Jewish history basically goes back to the Achronim, then to the Rishonim, the Gaonim, Amoraim, Tanaim, back into Bayit Sheni, but we're looking all within sort of one conventional chain of the Masorah. But what did Jews who weren't within that conventional chain of the Masorah, who were nonetheless observant, look like? And that's the important point, is that Philo is not an outlier in the sense that he's not observant. Philo is observant, and we're going to see examples, very interesting examples of that today. Philo is deeply observant. He's just not somebody that we would generally regard as standing sort of within the chain of the Masorah. And I referenced last time Dr. Belkin's doctoral dissertation from 80 plus years ago, called Philo and the Oral Law, in which Dr. Belkin tries to place Philo in a conversation somehow with those who are in the chain of the Masorah. Not that, and the claim is not that he was, but the claim is that we need to somehow position him alongside Jews who are kind of more conventional in that regard. So part of what I want to do is to introduce a community and people that largely go overlooked. And part of it at the same time is to try to trace this idea of synthesis, what it looked like for a community of people to be simultaneously engaged in their Judaism and in the outside world, try to trace that back through history as well. So that really is kind of what we saw last time. The argument that I made last time is that we can see the element of synthesis, Philo's emphasis on bringing into conversation his Jewish identity and his Greek identity. We can see that in a number of places. One important text that we looked at last time that I think illustrates this point very well is the way that Philo recounts the translation of the Torah into Greek. That's going to be a passage that we're going to look at. Other versions of that narrative are known, and we're going to look at one other passage about that episode as well. But what Philo has to say in that context is that the translation of the Torah into Greek was initiated by Greeks, by one of the early Greek kings who followed Alexander the Great. There was an appetite for the translation of the Torah into Greek on the part of the Greek world, precisely because the Greeks understood that the Jews were not, they were not enemies. They were not people who should be sidelined. They were people whose values were very much in sync with that of the Greek world. And the way that I put it last time is that Philo's trying to paint a picture of the Jews as being the best of the Greeks. Namely, it's not simply that you can be simultaneously Jewish and Greek, but rather that it's by being Jewish that you can simultaneously become Greek. So namely that whatever values the Greek world subscribed to, it's by being Jewish that you actually can be both Jewish and also achieve those Greek values. And so, for example, what I said last time is Greek values, for example, such as justice, such as courage, such as self-control, such as temperance, some of the core Greek virtues. What Philo is arguing is that it's by observing halacha and by being Jewish that you actually can attain and internalize those Greek virtues. And so in that way, what Philo is really arguing is not just that there is this compatibility between being Jewish and being Greek, but rather that it is by being Jewish that you can simultaneously become the most outstanding example of a Greek person. What Philo is basically arguing in the context of that story about the translation of the Torah into Greek is that the reason that the Greeks wanted the translation of the Torah is because they recognized that the Torah basically constituted the written law of nature. What I said last time is that Stoic philosophers and Stoic philosophy was the most important philosophical school at Philo's time. Again, Philo talking about first century of the Common Era, toward the end of Bayit Sheni. The Stoic philosophers sought to attain access to the unwritten law of nature. That is the law of nature that by sort of thinking about the way that the natural order is constructed, by reflecting on that, you would somehow understand not just something about the natural order, but you would understand something about the virtues that are embedded in the natural order. And that what Philo is claiming is that the Torah is the written version of that unwritten law of nature. And it's because you only have this one written version of an unwritten law of nature, basically what otherwise would only be accessible to Stoic philosophers who are reflecting on the natural order. And by reflecting on the natural order, seek to gain access to that law of nature. Because the Torah is this written law of nature, it really is in great demand. The Greek world recognized that there is something unique and therefore commissioned a translation of the Torah into Greek. Yeah.
Evidence that our lives actually suffused into Greek.
So what we're going to see, we're going to see, there's no actual evidence that took place, but we're going to see that Jews in Philo's time made that argument. Basically said, the question is whether, if in light of just chronologically, if the Torah precedes Greek literature, so then, and the formulation of the virtues that we're going to be talking about, is it possible that in fact the Torah inspired Greek philosophy? We have no evidence to that effect, but we're going to see that Greeks in Philo's time and slightly before that actually made that argument in order to claim that the Torah is superior to Greek philosophy. Okay, fine. So that's sort of just by way of reiteration. What I want to look at now, we're going to look at a couple of things. What I want to start by looking at are concrete examples in which Philo makes this argument for why the observance of halacha makes Jews into the best of the Greeks. That narrative that we looked at about the translation of the Torah into Greek sort of frames that issue of Jews being the best of the Greeks in slightly abstract terms. But more concretely, how does Philo argue that observance of the Torah does make a Jew into the best of the Greeks? So that's what I want to look at That's what I want to look at now. That's first thing we're going to look at. Second thing that we're going to look at is I want to actually trace back that argument, namely that it's by observing halacha that Jews become the best of the Greeks. I want to actually trace that argument even earlier than Philo, basically to argue that Philo is not the originator of this argument. Philo, and this is why I named today's lecture Alexandria, a modern Orthodox hub in the ancient Greek world, because I want to claim that even while Philo is the representative of this community about whom we have the most information, who's left us the most in writing, he actually is one among a group of others, not all of whom were functioning at the same time, but actually a group of others that goes back several centuries that are trying to make this kind of argument. Namely, that there should be this fusion between Jew and Greek, and that it's by being Jewish that you become the best of the Greeks. So that's sort of the second prong of what I want to talk about, not just looking at how Philo makes this argument, but also hints of it in earlier Jewish Greek literature. Okay, let's start actually with source 2. So our initial subject here is how halacha helps Jews cultivate Greco-Roman virtue. So there were 4 cardinal virtues within the hierarchy of the sort of Greco-Roman philosophical system. There was courage, and we're going to see it's important to understand that the word for courage in Greek is andreia. The word for man in Greek is aner. Andreia, which generally gets translated as courage, literally means manliness. And so this is not just courage in some abstract sense. It's how does a man become the most manly man is basically what this virtue of courage signified in the Greek world. So courage is one virtue. Temperance is a second virtue. Justice is a third virtue. Self-control is a fourth virtue. And then in certain systems, piety and philanthropy. So that is love between individuals, a sense of community would have been a fifth and sixth virtue. So what Philo is going to argue is that we have evidence within halacha of those 6 virtues. And so therefore, by observing halacha, what you become an embodiment of those virtues and thereby become the best of the Greeks. That basically is the argument that we're going to see. Okay, the excerpt that I've chosen to focus on at the bottom of page 1 is the way that Philo describes the purpose of Shmira Shabbos. What is the purpose of observing Shabbos? Now, it's important to understand one additional point that I made last time, which is that in Philo's day, Philo is responding to accusations that are being leveled against the Jews, let's call it in around the year 40, 50 CE, something like that the Jews are, first of all, a lazy people. How do we know that they're a lazy people? Because they observe Shabbos. They take 1 out of every 7 days off. Further evidence that the Jews are lazy people is the fact that they observe Shemitah. 1 out of 7 years, they don't actually, they're not productive. There are other claims that are being made about the Jews at the same time. I said that there are also claims that the Jews are a misanthropic people, that they are a hateful people. And so in that way, if one of the Greek virtues was that you had to be philanthropic, you had to be somebody who was part of a community, what the Jews basically constitute is a misanthropic people because they eat amongst themselves, they marry themselves, they necessarily segregate themselves from the outside world. Shabbos, kashrus are all practices that distinguish Jews from the outside world. And so therefore, another claim that was leveled against Jews by their opponents during Philo's day is that the Jews are actually a hateful people. So there's a lot of cynicism toward Jewish practice, and there's a lot of hostility that was being directed against Jews during Philo's day. What Philo, therefore, is going to do in making this argument about synthesis, in basically saying that by being Jewish, you are simultaneously being the best of the Greeks, Philo is responding to this accusation. This is not an argument that Philo is making in a vacuum. This argument that it's necessary to observe Torah in order to become a good Greek is a response to these accusations that are being leveled against the Jews, namely by observing Shabbos, you are lazy. By marrying Jews, by observing the laws of kashrus, you are necessarily distinguishing yourselves from the outside world. What Philo is doing is he's framing an argument that is meant to defend Jews against the outside world. And again, in that way, we can think in terms of sort of contemporary politics. What does it mean for somebody to be embedded in an anti-Semitic world when that anti-Semitic world is leveling certain accusations? How exactly do we frame our Judaism as a sort of meaningful response? That was a live issue in Philo's day, and I think that what we're focusing on can be understood in that way as kind of an extension. Okay, so let's start at the bottom of page 1. This is Philo. In context here is not important. Philo has a work called Special Laws, in which 4 books in which he presents Torah and halacha in ways that are going to be intelligible to a Greek audience. Okay, Philo writes as follows. He says, on this day, on Shabbos, we are commanded to abstain from all work, not because the law inculcates slackness. He's explicitly responding to this accusation that Shabbos means that Jews are lazy. Not because the law inculcates slackness. On the contrary, it always inures men to endure hardship and incites them to labor, and spurns those who would idle their time away, and accordingly is plain in its direction to work the full 6 days, right? Meaning the Torah encourages work, it encourages industriousness, and so therefore you have to work a full 6 days. Its object, namely the object of Shabbos, is rather to give men relaxation from continuous and unending toil, and by refreshing their bodies with a regularly calculated system of remissions, to send them out renewed to their old activities. Namely, Shabbos actually advances the Jewish premium on industriousness. Right? If Judaism places a premium on work, you need to take a 7th day off to refresh yourself. And so therefore Shabbos, not only is Shabbos not a symptom of laziness, but it actually points to the Jewish premium on industriousness. Philo continues, further, when he forbids bodily labor on the 7th day, he permits the exercise of the higher activities. Namely, what is Shabbos doing? Shabbos is not only meant as a refresher, but it also is an opportunity for those employed in the study of the principles of virtue's lore. So each 7th day, there stand wide open in every city thousands of schools of good sense, temperance, courage, justice, and the other virtues, in which the scholars sit in order quietly, with ears alert and with full attention. So what do we do on Shabbos? On Shabbos, we study Torah, Philo says. And what are we studying when we study Torah? We're studying details about the Greco-Roman virtues. And what Philo has just done is Philo has listed all of the virtues and said, that's what we're studying on Shabbos. What are we doing on Shabbos? Philo is studying Torah. But what he's claiming on behalf of Torah is that Torah embodies the Greco-Roman virtues. And so really what we're trying to do on Shabbos is we're trying to refresh ourselves because we, like you, Greek world, place a premium on work, but we're also taking a day off where we can actually internalize the Greco-Roman virtues, because that's really what we're trying to do. And so in that way, it's by observing Shabbos that Jews become the best of the Greeks, not only by refreshing themselves, preparing for the next week of work, but also by taking a step back and reflecting on the virtues that make for a good Greek and Roman citizen. But among the vast, let's continue in this passage, among the vast number of particular truths and principles there studied, there stand out practically high above the others 2 main heads. One of duty to God as shown by piety and holiness, one of duty to men as shown by humanity and justice, each of them splitting up into multiform branches, all highly laudable. Philo says, I listed the first 4 virtues earlier, good sense, temperance, courage, justice, but in fact, there are a 5th and 6th virtues. These 5th and 6th virtues, piety and humanity. Humanity here in the Greek is philanthropia, love of humanity, sense of community that I said before. And what Philo is arguing here is that piety and love of humanity are actually the most important virtues, and that is precisely what we're focusing on Shabbos. So Philo is basically saying the Torah defines what are the most important of the virtues, and it's those virtues that we are trying to focus on single-mindedly on Shabbos. So what Philo is really presenting for a Greek audience is a version of Shabbos that not only cannot be condemned by a Greek audience, but actually should be admired. Right? Anybody who reveres the Greek virtues, who reveres the Greek way of life, who admires industriousness should actually admire Jews, should welcome Jews, should actually encourage the observance of Torah, because it's by observing something like Shabbos that a Jew can become the best of the Greeks. This argument that it's by observing the Torah that a Jew can become the best of the Greeks does not originate with Philo, as I said before. It's actually an argument that goes back centuries earlier than Philo's. Turn back to page 1. Let me introduce what this passage is. So the passage that we're going to read is from a work called Letter of Aristeas. Letter of Aristeas was written in around the year 150 BCE, so about 200 years before the passage that we just read. Letter of Aristeas is actually the earliest version of the account of the translation of the Torah into Greek that we have. We read a version of it last time in Philo. Chazal preserved several versions of it, but the earliest version that we have of it is in a work called Letter of Aristeas. Letter of Aristeas presents an extended account of how the translation of the Torah came to be translated into Greek. The version that we have in the Letter of Aristeas is slightly different than the version that we had in Philo. The version that we saw in Philo is one in which the King Ptolemy II commissions the translation of the Torah. According to Letter of Aristeas, it wasn't the king, it was actually the librarian of the Alexandrian library. The librarian of the Alexandrian library, according to this work called Letter of Aristeas, came to understand that there was this untranslated text called the Torah, and he went to the Greek king and asked the Greek king to commission the translation of the Torah, not because the librarian wanted to observe the Torah, which is more or less what Philo said last time, but because the librarian wanted copies of every classic of world literature and therefore needed to arrange for the translation of the Torah into Greek. The story in Letter of Aristeas, which is written by a Jew, but it's being written from the perspective of a Greek. It's important to understand that this is a Jewish work. What the Letter of Aristeas basically says is the Greek king, Ptolemy, sent a letter to the Kohen Gadol, commissioned the translation of the Torah. The Kohen Gadol sent a team of translators, and the bulk of this work, Letter of Aristeas, describes a symposium dialogue that took place between the king and these translators. Basically, the king goes around the room to each of 70 people and says, tell me what constitutes the best life, right? What is a good life? What does one have to do in order to achieve the philosophical ideal of living a good life? And each of the translators in turn gives his explanation. What we're going to read is one of the longer explanations in which the translator says it's through observing the laws of kashrus that you actually come to lead a good life. What I want to do in reading this passage in which one of these translators explains to the king the virtues of kashrus is think about how the understanding of kashrus here is similar to the way that Philo described the observance of Shabbos just before, right? Think about how it is that kashrus is here being presented in ways that would appeal to a Greek audience, and how it is that according to the Letter of Aristeas, it is by observing the laws of kashrus that one can become the best of the Greeks, right? And so in that way, what we're looking at here is actually an argument that does not originate with Philo, but that actually goes back several centuries even earlier. Okay, so let's take a look at this passage. This is the first source on page 1. Do not accept the exploded or discredited idea that it was out of regard for mice and the weasel and other such creatures that Moses ordained these laws with such scrupulous care. So again, this is responding to an accusation. There was an accusation that was being leveled against Jews. Jews love pigs more than and in this case, we're talking about weasels and mice, but Jews love pigs more than they do humans. Why do they love pigs more than they do humans? Because there is a law of capital punishment in halacha, but at the same time, you're not allowed to eat pig. It must be that Jews prioritize the life of a pig more than they do the life of a human. That was an accusation that was being leveled against Jews for observing the laws of kashrus, and the Letter of Aristeas is already trying to pick apart that argument. Namely, it's not out of regard for mice and the weasel that Moses ordained these laws. Not so. These laws have all been solemnly drawn up for the sake of justice, to promote holy contemplation and the perfecting of character. Letter of Aristaeus is going to make an argument that is similar to the one that the Ramban later will make, namely that there is a way in which the laws of kashrus are meant to cultivate virtue. Question is, what virtues are the laws of kashrus meant to cultivate according to Aristaeus? So far, what this translator of the Torah into Greek has told the king is that has something to do with justice. For of the winged characters, we're on the fourth line, for of the winged creatures of which we make use, all are gentle and distinguished by cleanliness, and they feed on grain and pulse, such as pigeons, doves, locusts, partridges, and also geese, and all similar fowl. But of the winged creatures, so therefore, meaning all kosher birds are basically gentle animals. But of the winged creatures which are forbidden, you will find that they are wild and carnivorous, and with their strength oppress the rest and procure their food with injustice at the expense of the tame fowl mentioned above. So what's the difference between a kosher bird and an unkosher bird? According to Aristaeus, the difference is that kosher birds are gentle. Birds that are not kosher are by definition aggressive, or by definition violent. Namely, they represent injustice, as opposed to more tame, more gentle animals, which represent justice. And not only these, but they also seize lambs and kids, and they do violence to men too, both the dead and the living. Through these creatures, then, by calling them unclean, he set up a symbol that those for whom the legislation was drawn up must practice righteousness and in spirit and oppress no one, trusting in their own strength, nor rob anyone of anything, but must guide their lives in accordance with justice, just as the gentle creatures among the birds above mentioned, consume pulses that grow upon the earth, and do not tyrannize to the destruction of their kindred. Namely, what do you learn by observing the laws of kashrus? You basically are what you eat. The Torah is trying to transmit the message that you need to eat gentle animals, because if you eat gentle animals, you will naturally acquire the virtue of justice. You will naturally become a gentle person. What the Torah is trying to tell you about non-kosher animals is if you eat non-kosher animals, you will come to naturally identify with them. You won't appreciate that it's important to be a just person because you're eating sort of unjust animals, is the way that Letter of Aristaeus is putting it. And therefore, what the Torah is teaching you is how to discriminate justice from injustice. What the Letter of Aristaeus so far has done is engaged in a process of allegorical interpretation. What I said last time is that Philo's primary method of interpreting the Torah is allegory. What that means is that for Philo, there is a surface level meaning of the Torah, but then there's also a symbolic, deeper meaning of the Torah. That symbolic, deeper meaning of the Torah is what Philo says is the genuine, authentic meaning of the Torah. So that, yes, you are supposed to refrain from eating certain foods. The Torah is promoting the consumption of certain foods, but really what that symbolizes is something deeper, namely the virtue of justice. And it's through allegorical interpretation that what Letter of Aristaeus and Philo also, what they are going to do is they're going to transform what seem to be kind of parochial laws that are designed specifically, exclusively for Jews. Through allegory, what Philo, Letter of Aristaeus, and other Greeks are doing is they are translating them into terms that would have appealed to a non-Jewish audience. Allegory becomes important because it's the way in which these Greek writers are bridging the gap between practices that are distinctively Jewish and practices that would have been acceptable to the Greeks. Here, the idea of kashrus is its allegorical significance is it represents justice, is so far what Letter of Aristaeus has said. Okay, let's continue. By such examples, then, we're about halfway through. By such examples, then, the lawgiver has commended to men of understanding a symbol that they must be just and achieve nothing by violence, nor confiding in their own strength must they oppress others. Right? That's the lesson that you learn. For if it is lawful not even to touch the creatures aforementioned because of their several natures, how must we not in every way guard our characters from degenerating to a similar state? So this is a little bit of a puzzle. The Torah doesn't say you're not allowed to touch living non-kosher animals. The Torah says that you become temporarily tameh if you touch the carcass of a non-kosher animal. So letter of Aristaeus seems to be taking that one step further and says the Torah requires that you refrain from touching these animals, because if you refrain from touching them, you will come to understand allegorically that you are supposed to distance yourself from sources of injustice. All the regulations concerning what is permissible with reference to these and other creatures, he has set forth by way of allegory, right? Explicitly makes this reference to the fact that the laws of kashrus might be something that we observe, but their underlying significance is allegorical. For the parting of the hoof and the cloven foot is a symbol to discriminate in each of our actions with a view to what is right. So namely, why is it that we have certain signs of a kosher animal, namely that kosher animals have to have cloven feet and hooves that are parted? The idea here is that you have to somehow separate yourselves. You have to in some way distance yourselves from sources of injustice. And how does the Torah communicate that? By assigning certain signs that distinguish between kosher and non-kosher. So this is a way in which what letter of Aristaeus is saying is there is allegorical significance, not only to the type of birds that you're allowed to eat, right? Not only that you're only allowed to eat certain tame, gentle birds, but even the signs of kosher animals represent allegorically that a person is supposed to distance themselves from sources of evil, from sources of injustice. The legislation was not laid down at random or by some caprice of the mind, but with a view to truth and as a token of right reason. Namely, none of this is arbitrary. All of this was carefully thought through. For by detailed injunctions concerning food and drink and touch, he bids us to do nothing and hearken to nothing heedlessly, and not by misusing the power of reason to resort to injustice. So if what Philo said about the laws of Shabbos is that the laws of Shabbos do promote industriousness and are an occasion for learning more about virtue, what letter of Aristaeus is saying is that the laws of kashrus function in a similar way. Namely, if one of the important virtues within the Greco-Roman hierarchy of virtue is justice, what the laws of kashrus do is they teach you to internalize the importance of justice allegorically. Because what you are supposed to do as a person who is shomer kashrus is you are supposed to refrain from eating certain animals that have certain signs and animals that have certain attributes. And in that way, if you observe the laws of kashrus, you will become the best of the Greeks who place a premium on justice. And so in the same way that Philo was responding to accusations leveled against the Jews by the Greeks about Shabbos, letter of Aristaeus is doing something similar about the laws of kashrus. Kashrus are not something to condemn. Kashrus is not a sign of distinction, of hateful distinction. Kashrus, to the contrary, is a sign of admirable distinction, of distancing, right? And in that way, should be something that is admired by the Greeks. Again, what letter of Aristaeus, like Philo, is trying to do is to argue for the compatibility, for synthesis between Jew and Greek. Yes. Okay, the question was, is there any evidence that these arguments made a difference? No, there's no evidence. And to the contrary, the arguments that I was the arguments that I was repeating before don't disappear. So if the letter of Aristaeus is being written in around the year 150 BCE and Philo is writing what we just read in 50 CE, these arguments continue to be made in Greek and Roman literature that we have centuries later. So it's falling on deaf ears. That shouldn't necessarily surprise us. But nonetheless, the importance for us is understanding that there is this effort to make these arguments. Yes. Yeah, so the question was, is this really something that are these propositions that they're committed to, or is this simply apologetics? So, what I would say is that let's take Philo for a second. Philo's commitment to allegory is so thoroughgoing. It's the way that he interprets everything in the Torah to such an extent that I would say that I think this is something that Philo is committed to, meaning when Philo reads the Torah, he doesn't first say, I see its surface level meaning. It can't mean that. Let me try to probe its deeper allegorical significance. He naturally gravitates toward an allegorical meaning. That's the way that he interprets the entire Torah. So I think probably he'll naturally see it this way. And he's using it for apologetic ends, but I think that he's basically committed to this way of thinking about the Torah. Yeah, in the back.
Sometimes we say that, that means that you don't have to do.
Okay, so we're going to come to that in 1 second. Yeah. Okay, so that is literally the next passage. Literally, the next passage is exactly what you're saying. So just hold off, and we're going to get to that right now. If Philo and Letter of Aristeas are basically saying there's allegorical significance, and people in this Alexandrian Jewish community are basically saying we can view positively the contact between Jew and Greek. We can view in positive terms the observance of Torah and also Greek ideals, and we can be both Jewish and Greek at the same time. It's clear that there are dissenting views within this community. And that even while it's true that this was a community of observant Jews, there were Jews who went even further than Philo. And what we're going to see now is, in going further than Philo, these are Jews who completely bought into the notion that the Torah had allegorical significance. Namely, if Homeric literature can be understood in allegorical terms, which is how scholars of Homeric literature understood Homer, something that we talked about a little bit last time, Jews within Philo's own cultural context believed the same thing about Torah, but they took it a step further. So what I want to look at now is, how were other Jews who we would characterize as modern Orthodox in this way of arguing for synthesis, how did they understand the relationship between their Jewish identity and their Greek identity, maybe a little bit differently than Philo? And how did Philo push back against them? Namely, if what we've just been saying is that Philo's target audience is partly Greek, is partly these Greeks who are making arguments in opposition to Judaism. What about Philo's message to his fellow Jews? What exactly is his message there? Okay, so we're turning ahead to the bottom of page 3. This is Philo responding to Jews who are doing exactly that, who are prioritizing allegory over performance. We're basically taking Philo's project of allegory and saying, once we accept the premise that the Torah has allegorical significance, we no longer actually have to observe the Torah at all. Namely, once we understand the allegorical meaning underlying, for example, bris milah, we don't have to actually circumcise ourselves. Once we understand the allegorical meaning underlying Shabbos, we no longer have to actually observe Shabbos. Those are the arguments that these Jews that Philo is going to reference now make, and we'll have to think about what that means in terms of their Jewish identity and how it is that Philo is responding to them. Okay, so taking a look, this gives us a little bit of a broader sense of what this Alexandrian Jewish community looked like, right? That it's not monolithic. The modern Orthodoxy, the way that I'm putting it, the modern Orthodoxy within Philo's own community was not monolithic. If this community really represents synthesis, it's both Greek and Jewish, it wasn't Greek and Jewish in the same way for everyone who lived there, and Philo gives us a window into what some others said. Okay, so bottom of page 3, this is what I have here as source 5. There are some who, regarding laws in their literal sense, in the light of symbols of matters belonging to the intellect, are over punctilious about the latter, while treating the former with easygoing neglect. Namely, if the latter are symbols, if the former is literal. So namely, there are those who prioritize allegory over the literal meaning of halacha. Such men, I for my part should blame for handling the matter in too easy and offhand a manner. They ought to have given careful attention to both aims. Namely, it's important both to understand the literal meaning of halacha, what halacha actually demands of you, as well as the allegorical significance of halacha. So they ought to have given careful attention to both aims, to a more full and exact investigation of what is not seen, and what is seen to be stewards without reproach. Okay, jump ahead to the middle of the 6th line from the bottom. These men are taught by the sacred word to have thought for good repute, and to let go nothing that is part of the customs fixed by divinely empowered men greater than those of our time. So namely, these are people who are committed to their Judaism, and yet they're not committed to the observance of the customs that are part of Judaism. And now he gives concrete examples. It is quite true that the 7th day is meant to teach the power of the unoriginate and the non-action of created beings. Namely, what Shabbos teaches us is the hierarchy of man in relation to God. God is a providential God. God is a creative God. And we're supposed to understand where man fits within the hierarchy of sort of the divine economy. We stand subordinate to God. That's basically the message of Shabbos. But once you understand that that's the message of Shabbos, you're not now free to go ahead and violate Shabbos. Meaning, you might say, what do we study halacha for? We study halacha in order to probe the allegorical meaning of halacha. Once we understand the allegorical meaning of halacha, if that's the goal toward which our study is targeted, so then once we understand the allegorical meaning, we don't have to actually observe halacha at all. That's the claim that these people are making. So once they understand the allegorical symbolism of Shabbos, Philo says, but let us not for this reason abrogate the laws laid down for its observance, and light fires, or till the ground, or carry loads, or institute proceedings in court, or act as jurors, or demand the restoration of deposits or recover loans, or do all else that we are permitted to do as well on days that are not festival seasons. Namely, he's listing a whole bunch of areas of Hilchos Shabbos that these people are not observing. And the reason they're not observing them is because they went ahead, they studied these laws, they distilled the allegorical meaning of these laws into this one proposition, namely that man is subordinate to God. God is all powerful, God is providential, God is creative. And once they understood that, they stopped observing halacha. Philo says the fact that you understood the allegorical meaning of halacha is not an excuse to stop observing halacha at all. And now he goes on and gives other examples. Top of the next page, top of page 4. It is true also that the keeping of festivals is a symbol of gladness of soul and of thankfulness to God. That, again, the allegorical symbolism of the Chagim is the fact that you are supposed to be a thankful person, supposed to be the idea of gratitude. So you might say, once you understand that, so now you cultivate the virtue of gratitude and of gladness. So therefore, once you do that, you don't have to actually observe the halachos of Yantiv anymore. But we should not, for this reason, turn our back on the general gathering of the year's seasons. Namely, you don't stop observing the Chagim just because you understand the allegorical symbolism underlying the Chagim. And he goes on and he says, it is true that receiving circumcision does indeed portray the excision of pleasure and all passions. So namely for Philo, that's what Bris Milah represented. Bris Milah was a physical observance that really represented the importance of distancing yourself from sexual pleasure and of passion. So apparently this group of people in Philo's day, in the Alexandria Philo's day, stopped circumcising their children because they said, once we understand that circumcision represents the need to distance ourselves from passion and pleasure, we don't have to circumcise. Let's just figure out a way to get at that same goal. But let us not, on the 5th line, let us not on this account repeal the law laid down for circumcising. Why? We shall be ignoring the sanctity of the temple and 1,000 other things if we are going to pay heed to nothing except what is shown to us by the inner meaning of things. We're going to basically stop observing halacha if we only focus on the allegory and not on the surface level. Nay, we should look on all these outward observances as resembling the body and their inner meanings as resembling the soul. It follows that exactly as we have to take thought for the body because it is the abode of the soul, so we must pay heed to the letter of the laws. You need to observe both halacha and at the same time try to probe halacha's allegorical symbolic significance. And the relationship between those two, according to Philo, is the relationship between the body and the soul. In the same way that you have to preserve the body in order to promote the health of the soul, same thing is true when it comes to the observance of halacha. Both of those are necessary. And so what is interesting about this group is this group subscribes to Philo's insistence on the allegorical significance of halacha. They say that the reason that we study halacha is to understand the symbolic significance embedded in halacha by God. But they're going an important step further in saying, and now that we understand that allegorical significance, we no longer have to actually observe the Torah at all. Now, it's important to understand how to position this group. we don't have, again, this is beyond our frame of reference. We can't, right? I'm not even sure. This group are not contemporary, for example, Reform Jews. That's not what this group represents. This group represents a group of Orthodox Jews who simply have stopped observing halacha, but they've stopped observing halacha because they're saying, all that we're doing is we studied halacha, we understood the point of halacha, and so now we are sort of extrapolating from halacha the way that we are supposed to live our lives. And in doing so, we don't actually have to observe halacha. It's not that they're saying we are abolishing halacha, but they're saying we have internalized the message of halacha to such an extent that we no longer have to do it. They're not arguing that halacha is not relevant. They're arguing that halacha is just meant as instrumental. And if you understand, if you are wise enough, if you are sufficiently well-versed in philosophy to understand how to get at that ultimate end, halacha is not relevant for you anymore. It's a totally different argument. What's fascinating, I think, is, again, it gives us a window into a community, a modern or proto-modern Orthodox community committed to synthesis, but that can't easily be plotted in ways that are familiar to us. Philo, in many ways, is foreign. This group is even more foreign, but this is not, for example, this is not not only is it not a reform, they're not a Christian group, right? This is not a group that has abandoned halacha simply in deference to the allegorical significance. Yeah, Joseph.
It's true that it's not current reform, but it sounds very much like some of the Reform Judaism and even conservative Judaism of the 30s and 40s, which I think was closer to that than certainly in 2024.
Okay, so absolutely, and I think what's interesting about that is I think I said last time that Philo becomes sort of a hero to the early Christians. And so you can see the way in which this outlook does lead, let's say, a certain amount of time later, however much, right, whether it's 75 years, 100 years, 150 years, but you can begin to think about how this kind of outlook does lead to Christianity. So I think that that's very fair. I think it's just the one important point that I'm trying to emphasize is we shouldn't interpret this group as advocating the abolition of halacha. So I think as long as we can sort of present them in Orthodox terms, even if you want to say that they're, proto-conservative from the 1930s, I would be comfortable with that. Yeah.
That those who were very committed to halacha and were very careful about kashrus, et cetera, and didn't care about the allegorical nature, and therefore acted as such, and therefore weren't particularly concerned with justice, et cetera.
Meaning, were there Jews who were only focused on the literal and weren't interested at all in the allegorical? But that's the question. Yeah, yes. So it's clear that Philo is responding to a number of different Jewish groups. One Jewish group is this group that is advocating for the allegory only. Another group that we're going to see are those who said, actually, the Torah is completely, it's anti-philosophical, it's nonsense. And so what Philo needs to say to those Jews is, no, it's actually deeply philosophical. And then there's going to be a third group, which is going to say, sort of like the more common people, right? Not people who have the luxury of studying philosophy, who are going to say, all that there is in the Torah is just the literal meaning. Yes. So there's going to be that range. And it's important to understand that there is that range in the same way that modern Orthodoxy today is complicated. It can't be, I think, necessarily reduced to one specific type. The same thing is true in Philo's day as well. Yeah.
Don't study philosophy. Shayat Leibniz was a great philosopher, and yet his position was halacha is halacha.
Correct.
And all the
Yeah,
stuff,
absolutely. Right. So we don't see, that we don't necessarily see that version of a Jew. We don't necessarily see, but yeah, I think it's fair. Yeah. Right. So that I think that's the question is, how exactly do you perpetuate Judaism if what you're saying is we don't actually have to observe Judaism, we just have, and it could be that's why you can begin to trace a line connecting such a group and their outlook with, what will become Christian. I'm not arguing that this group does become Christian, but you can understand why their outlook would become. We just have to, just one more text. Again, I'm not running anywhere, but we do have about 6 or 7 minutes left, so I just want to get through this. Okay, the last source that we're going to look at, source 6, comes at this sort of question of allegory from a different perspective. This is a group of Jews that Philo says think that the Torah is filled with nonsense, meaning it's people that actually do prioritize allegory, that do prioritize philosophy, but when they look in the Torah, they see a very non-philosophical work. So let's take a look at this passage here. This is from a different work of Philo's called On Confusion of Tongues. The point of departure here is the story of Migdal Bavel. And Philo is going to talk about two narratives in this context. The narrative about Migdal Bavel, namely the idea that you had this people that were trying to build a ladder all the way up to God, and the story of animals speaking human language in Gan Eden. Okay, so let's take a look at this passage. Persons who cherish a dislike of the institutions of our fathers, and it becomes clear that from later that Philo's talking about Jews who dislike the institutions of our fathers, and make it their constant study to denounce and decry the laws, find in these and similar passages openings, as it were, for their godlessness. Can you still say these impious scoffers speak gravely of the ordinances as containing the canons of absolute truth? For see, your so-called holy books contain also myths, which you regularly deride when you hear them related by others. Namely, Philo derides Homeric myth, but look, the Torah also contains an equal amount of myth. And indeed, they continue. It is needless to collect the numerous examples scattered about the law book, as we might had we leisure to spend in exposing its failings. Namely, if we just went systematically through the Torah, we'd find lots of such examples, but we have but to remind you of the instances which lie at our very feet and ready to our hands. One of these we have here, which resembles the fable told of the Alloid, who, according to Homer, the greatest and most reputed of poets, planned to pile the 3 loftiest mountains on each other in one heap, hoping that when these were raised to the height of the upper sky, they would furnish an easy road to heaven for those who wished to ascend thither. Jump ahead to the part after that indented excerpt, the word folly, second line here. Folly indeed, surely dreadful madness, for if one should lay a small foundation and build up upon it the different parts of the whole earth, rising in the form of a single pillar, it would still be divided by vast distances from the sphere of ether. Namely, this is nonsense. It doesn't make sense to have a story in which people think that they can somehow reach heaven from earth. This is clearly anti-philosophical, mythological nonsense. And so therefore, Philo, your claim that somehow the Torah is full of deep symbolic significance and that somehow it's of value to a philosophically oriented Greek audience, everything in the Torah defies that belief. Philo goes on to give another example. This is the last paragraph here in the same excerpt. Another similar story is to be found in the writings of the mythologists, telling of the days when all animals had a common language. Again, what you have in the story of Gan Eden is similarly mythological. And so the burden that Philo accepts upon himself is to try to argue that even these narratives have philosophical significance. So let's take the example from Gan Eden. What Philo argues is that the snake represents pleasure or passion. Philo was deeply misogynistic, as were many people in Philo's day, but Philo is deeply misogynistic. What he says about Chava represents pleasure, the Nachash represents sort of the tempting of pleasure, or Chava represents those who are inclined toward pleasure. And so the way that Philo understands the story of Gan Eden is that you basically have the snake who represents the tempter, represents pleasure. You have Chava who represents the person who can easily succumb to pleasure. And so therefore it's a challenge to overcome your natural instincts and to resist pleasure. Is basically the way that Philo understands the story of Gan Eden. What he basically does is he vindicates the philosophical significance of the story by saying it's not nonsense, responding to those Jews in his context who said there's nothing philosophical here. And what Philo is arguing to them is, no, there's actually something deeply allegorical. So Philo is engaging in this project of allegorical interpretation with a number of goals in mind. He's responding to those Greeks who are pointing to the Torah and saying that halacha is anti-Greek, is anti-philosophical, to which Philo says, no, actually Philo and others in his community and others in Alexandria are saying, no, actually it's deeply philosophical, it's deeply allegorical, and it's by observing halacha that a Jew becomes the best of the Greeks. That's sort of one prong of his argument, one target audience. Other target audiences of Philo's are Jews in his community. Some of these Jews accepted wholesale the allegorical meaning of halacha, but took it one step further than Philo was comfortable and said, because of the allegorical meaning of halacha, we no longer actually have to observe halacha at all. To which Philo says, no, actually, in the same way that we value body and soul, you also have to value the literal observance and the allegorical significance of halacha, right? Philo is trying to navigate that fine line, and he's also responding to those in his context who maybe are extremely philosophically oriented, but are looking at the Torah and saying there's nothing of philosophical meaning here, it's all nonsense, to which Philo says, no, I can show you how what we have here is very respectable allegory. There's also a different audience of people, and this can't really be reduced to one excerpt, which is why I didn't include it here, which goes back to Joseph's question before. There are those who were just simply not inclined toward allegory, who didn't see anything really of great value in the Torah, who observed the Torah, but didn't think that there was anything particularly deep or profound about it. And what Philo says to such people is, no, there's actually much more here than meets the eye. And it actually says to these people as well, it's by observing the Torah that you are not only a good Jew, saying this to the Jews among his community, it's not only that you are a good Jew by observing halacha, but you are actually simultaneously being a good Greek. That's the message that what I've argued this proto-modern Orthodox Jew is trying to communicate to these different complicated audiences. Okay, thank you very much.